In the sultry air of a drizzly night, Bruce, an 8-year-old boy, rushed into the crowded city street, clutching the small bag of candy he had just bought with the last of his money. His every breath was heavy, mixed with the feeling of despair that crept into every cell, but he knew he couldn't stop. The image of his mother, her pale face and weak body, haunted his mind, making his steps stronger. He didn't allow himself to be discouraged, knowing that he only had a few hours left to save the only woman in the world he loved more than life itself. It was dark. Cars passed by him without stopping, as if no one noticed the small boy standing trembling on the side of the road. When the traffic light turned red, Bruce quickly walked over, holding the bag of candy high in his hand, and began to ask for spare change from the drivers. "Please help me. I need money to buy medicine for my mother. Please help my mother." His voice echoed through the noise of the street, through the blaring of car horns, full of longing but also choked. Some people glanced at him and then turned away. Others just shook their heads, ignoring him as if he were part of the chaotic scene here. With each rejection, Bruce's heart ached more, but he did not give up. He knew he had to be stronger, had to try harder. From car to car, each small coin was placed in his hand. Bruce smiled weakly, thanking those who helped. Although he received very little, each coin carried a glimmer of hope for him, and he did not let it slip away. A man in a luxury car saw him from afar. His eyes briefly sparkled with curiosity and then sank when he saw the boy standing shivering on the side of the road in the pouring rain. As he approached the car door, he spoke, "I need money to buy medicine for my mother. My mother is very sick. I only have today." Tears filled Bruce's eyes, but he maintained his resolute expression, not letting fear and despair overwhelm him. The man sat silently, seemingly speechless. His eyes were fixed on Bruce's face, and it seemed that in that moment he saw a familiar figure from the past appear. Like a lightning strike, he recognized the face of Chloe, the woman he once loved. Old memories rushed back, bringing with them a feeling of pain and regret, making his heart heavy. Chloe, that woman. Could this be my child? He sighed, his eyes silently following Bruce. Finally, he gently opened the car door, stepping out in the astonishment of those around him. Bruce raised his head, his eyes shining with fragile hope. He slowly walked closer and bent down to the boy's eye level, his voice warm but with hidden pain. "Boy, what's your name?" "I'm Bruce," he replied, his eyes widening at the sudden concern from the stranger. "And your mother? Is your mother?" Chloe asked, his voice seemingly trembling. Bruce nodded slightly, his eyes shining. The man took a deep breath, his eyes looking sadly at the boy in front of him. In that brief moment, he felt something sacred and close. He stood up straight, took out a wallet, and took out a large sum of money, handing it to Bruce. "Use this money to take your mother to a place where she can be treated. Promise me you will never give up, like you didn't give up to save your mother tonight." Bruce was silent for a few seconds, his hands shaking as he took the money from the man. He didn't fully understand the meaning of the moment, but a strange warmth spread through his heart. He looked into the man's eyes, which held deep sympathy and perhaps something more than familiarity. "I promise." "I will never give up," Bruce replied softly, his eyes filled with determination. And from that moment on, he knew that whether his mother survived or not, he would always remember this strange yet familiar man as a guiding light in the years to come. Bruce stood in the bustling crowd, his eyes still blurred with tears, but his determination undiminished. The coins the woman in the car had thrown rolled around at his feet, a reminder of what he was trying for. Bruce let out a sigh, picking them up, trying to push the hurt deep inside. He couldn't stop now. Every coin he earned was a small chance for his mother. He turned to the car next to him, repeating his plea with a faint hope, but the only response was indifferent looks and rapidly rolled-up windows. Suddenly, in the midst of the crowded and noisy crowd, Bruce saw a woman walking along the sidewalk near the traffic light. She was wearing a white shirt, a black skirt, looking elegant and confident. She was about 30 years old, her hair neatly combed like a symbol of class. Bruce didn't pay much attention until she swayed, clutching her chest, her eyes gradually fading. What happened? Bruce muttered in panic, his eyes fixed on the woman. He later learned her name was Rose. Staggered and fell, her breathing ragged. Without another thought, Bruce dropped the candy on the sidewalk and rushed towards her. "Ma, are you okay?" He knelt down beside her, his voice filled with concern and fear. The woman's face was twisted in pain, her breathing weak. She tried to say something, but her lips trembled. "Please, calm down, I'll help you." Bruce tried to stay calm despite his panic, the memory of his mother having suffered the same pain clearly appearing. He looked around, hoping someone would come to help, but the crowd around him seemed to notice nothing unusual. Why isn't anyone stopping? Why isn't anyone helping? Bruce thought helplessly as his despair gradually overwhelmed him. The woman opened her eyes weakly, coughing and struggling to stay conscious. "Help me," she whispered, her voice weak. Bruce quickly grabbed his phone, dialing the emergency number he kept for his mother's needs. His voice trembled as he described Rose's location and condition, hoping they would arrive soon. Holding the woman's hand, Bruce felt the same helplessness and fear he had felt with his mother. "Just hold on. The paramedics will be here soon," he whispered, not sure if those words helped her or him more. The ambulance's lights slowly appeared, the light flashing like a ray of hope. "See, I told you they would be here," Bruce said, smiling slightly but still worried. When the paramedics arrived and began to treat Rose, she looked at Bruce with eyes full of gratitude. "You didn't tell me your name, did you?" "I'm Rose, but why did you help me?" Her voice was weak but filled with curiosity. Bruce looked into her eyes, tears welling up. Because my mother is very sick, and I don't want anyone to suffer like that. I thought, if my mother was in this situation, someone would help her. It's the least one person should do," he said, hoping that if the same thing happened to his mother, someone would reach out to help. Rose held his hand tightly, her eyes filled with gratitude as she was placed on a stretcher and prepared to be loaded into the ambulance. She whispered, "You're a special boy, Bruce." When they reached the hospital, Bruce followed quietly, determined to stay until Rose was safe. He had promised himself that he would never abandon anyone. Although he still cared about his mother, he knew he couldn't leave right now. In the ambulance, he sat next to Rose, watching the nurses tend to her. Her face gradually became calmer, but still a little tired. "You don't have to stay. I know you're worried about your mother," Rose said, her eyes sparkling with sincerity. Bruce shook his head, determination clear in his voice. "I can't leave you like this. I'll go back and find a way to make money to save your mother, but I can't leave you alone right now." At the hospital, Bruce waited outside the emergency room, his eyes fixed on the clock on the wall. Each passing moment weighed heavily on his mind. He was still worried about his mother, but at the same time he felt relieved that Rose had survived. Finally, the door opened and Rose walked out, looking more stable. It was just an anxiety attack. "Thanks to you, I'm safe," she smiled gently, her voice softer than before. Bruce let out a sigh of relief, but his worry about his mother returned. "I have to go, my mother is very weak." Rose looked at him, her eyes serious. "You waited for me, knowing that your mother didn't have much time left." Right, he nodded, trying to hold back the tears. "Yes, but my mother's medicine is expensive," Bruce said softly, worry written all over his face. Rose smiled softly. "You have a good heart, Bruce. Now it's time for me to help you." Bruce's heart raced as he clutched the small vial of medicine to his chest, his mind filled with the desperate hope of saving his mother. He sprinted through the dimly lit streets, the sounds of the city fading into a distant hum, swallowed by the pounding of his own heartbeat. Every step feels like a battle against time, as if he were running not just against the clock, but against fate itself. He had left her in a critical state, and with each passing second, the urgency grew, his breathing quickening with fear and determination. As he neared the hospital, the imposing building loomed ahead, its tall, sterile facade almost mocking his efforts. He pushed harder, feeling his legs ache and his lungs burn, but he refused to slow down. His mother needed him. He will not let anything stand in his way. Bursting through the hospital doors, he barely noticed the concerned glances of the staff as he dashed down the hallway, each hallway stretching on endlessly as if testing his resolution. When he finally reached her room, the sound of frantic beeping sent a chill down his spine. Bruce's heart plummeted as he saw the medical team surrounding his mother's bed, their faces drawn in tense concentration. His mother, Chloe, lay there, pale and fragile, her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. He stumbled forward, almost collapsing from exhaustion, but he held the vial out to the doctor, his hands trembling. "I brought the medicine." "Please give it to her now," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper as he fought back tears. The doctor took the vial, glancing at Bruce with a mix of sympathy and determination. Without a word, he administered the medication, injecting it into Chloe's IV line as Bruce watched anxiously. The seconds felt like hours, the silence thick with uncertainty, broken only by the irregular beeps of the monitors that seemed to mirror his own heartbeat. He sat down beside her, gently taking her hand, which felt cold and fragile in his grasp. His mind raced with memories of her, the warmth of her smile, the strength in her voice, and the countless times she had comforted him through his own struggles. Now all he wanted was for her to open her eyes and smile at him again. Suddenly, Chloe's eyelids fluttered, her gaze hazy and distant as she struggled to focus on her son's face. Bruce leaned in closer, his heart swelling with both hope and fear. Her voice was faint, each word a struggle as if it took all her remaining strength to speak. "Bruce, my son, don't feel guilty. You've been everything I ever dreamed of," she whispered, her words barely audible. He squeezed her hand, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Mom, I'm here now. I brought the medicine. You're going to get better." Chloe's lips parted, and she seemed to summon strength from deep within, her gaze softening as if she were looking beyond him, into a place only she could see. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "About your father." Bruce's heart skipped a beat. She had never spoken of his father before, and in this fragile moment it seemed like a secret too heavy to bear. He waited. The room fell into a stillness that felt sacred, every word she uttered hanging in the air. "He left something for you." A photo she managed, her eyes closing for a moment, as if the effort was too much. "In my bag." Bruce quickly searched through her belongings, finding an old, worn photograph hidden among her things. He held it up, his eyes scanning the face of a man he had never seen before, his father's image forever frozen in time. But his mind was elsewhere, focused solely on his mother's labored breathing, each shallow rise and fall of her chest a painful reminder of her fragile state. "Mom, we'll talk about this later when you're feeling better. Right now, just rest," he whispered, his voice breaking as he tried to sound hopeful, to believe that she could pull through. But Chloe's eyes began to close, her grip on his hand loosening. Her breaths grew more faint, and Bruce could feel her slipping away, the steady rhythm of the monitors echoing his own mounting despair. Desperately, he clutched her hand, his voice trembled. "Mom, please, stay with me. I need you," he begged, his words tumbling out in a flood of raw emotion. The monitor's beeps began to slow, the steady cadence faltering, each sound a painful reminder of her slipping further away. The doctor approached him, his face solemn as he placed a hand on Bruce's shoulder. "She's fallen into a coma," he said quietly, his voice gentle but filled with the weight of inevitability. "We did everything we could, but her body, it's very weak. Now we can only wait." The word coma hit Bruce like a blow, the reality sinking in slowly, unbearably. He collapsed into the chair by her bedside, still holding her hand, his heart heavy with a grief that he could barely comprehend. Everything feels surreal, as if he was trapped in a nightmare he couldn't escape. Time seemed to stand still, the whine of machinery the only sound in the room, a painful reminder of his life hanging by a thread. Bruce's eyes fell on the photo in his hand, the face of the man who had given him life but was absent for every moment. The revelation of his father's existence seemed distant, almost insignificant against the sheer terror of losing his mother. As the minutes turned into hours, he remained by her side, whispering softly to her, hoping that his words would reach her, that his presence could somehow anchor her to this world. His mind reeled with unasked questions, unspoken words and memories now bitter and sweet, each a reminder of the love they shared and the time they might never have again. The night passed, and Bruce remained there silent and vigilant, like a sentinel by his mother's bedside, praying for a miracle in the midst of despair. Bruce opened his eyes, startled, as cold raindrops began to fall on his face. He slowly sat up, clutching his backpack, as if it were the last vestige of safety he had left. The rain was pouring down, and he knew he wouldn't be able to sit on the bench for long. He had to find shelter, somewhere he could escape the relentless downpour. His mind raced as he scanned the dark surroundings. He couldn't go far. He wanted to be as close to the hospital as possible, to his mother. The thought of her alone in that sterile room, hovering between life and death, drove him to want to be close. There had to be somewhere a hidden corner, an entrance, anything that could shield him from the rain. His eyes fell on a small bus stop across the street. It wasn't much, but it would provide him shelter from the storm. Bruce ran through the rain, his feet splashing into the puddles that had quickly formed along the street. By the time he reached the shelter, he was soaked, the cold seeping into his bones. He plopped down on the cold metal chair, clutching his backpack to his chest and closing his eyes. But sleep remained elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, memories flooded back to him: his mother's laughter, her gentle hands stroking his hair, the warmth that once filled their humble home. Now those moments felt like they were slipping away, distant echoes of a life he could barely remember. As the rain continued to fall, Bruce's mind drifted to his father, the man in the crumpled photograph he'd tucked into his pocket. He'd never met him, never even heard his voice. His mother rarely spoke of him, and Bruce had learned not to ask too many questions. But now, as his life fell apart, he found himself wishing he knew more. Maybe, just maybe, his father would care, would help if he knew. He took out the photo, studying the face in the dim streetlight. It was strange to see someone who looked like him, but was a stranger. A painful hope flared in his chest, then quickly turned to bitterness. Why should he hope for someone who had never been there? A small sob escaped his lips, which he quickly suppressed, not wanting to appear weak even here, alone in the dark. He stuffed the photo back into his backpack and hugged it tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility weighing down on him. He needed to be strong for his mother, for himself. Tomorrow he would find a way to continue. Maybe he could talk to the hospital staff, see if they knew of a nearby shelter. There had to be some way to survive, to be near her. The night dragged on, and the rain finally slowed to a light drizzle. Exhausted and shaking, Bruce curled up on the bench, his eyes heavy with fatigue. He thought of his mother's face, her fragile smile, and whispered into the darkness, "I'll take care of you, Mom. I promise." When dawn finally broke, the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, casting a weak light over the wet streets. Bruce woke with a start, stiff and sore from the cold night. The reality of his situation hit him with renewed force, but he fought back the despair, telling himself to be strong. He wiped the rain from his face, determined to return to the hospital as soon as visiting hours began. Bruce opened his eyes and felt the first cold drops of rain fall on his face. At that moment he realized he was sitting on a wooden bench in the park. It started to rain, from a few drops falling sporadically, then quickly turning into a heavy downpour. Bruce quickly stood up, trying to find shelter, but the quiet park had no roof. The torrential rain wrapped around him, water seeping through every layer of clothing, flowing into the small backpack he held tightly to protect his precious belongings. "God, please help me. I don't know what to do anymore. Please save my mother and me," Bruce whispered in his heart. The prayer was urgent and desperate, like the sound of rain falling on the petals of the flowers and leaves around him. He felt as if each drop of rain fell on his shoulders, making the worries weighing down on his heart heavier. The cold wind cut into his skin. The cold from outside was like a sharp knife, constantly cutting into Bruce's fragile skin. With no hope but to find shelter, Bruce turned his eyes to the nearby hospital, the lights from the windows shining in the rain like small beacons in the darkness. "Maybe they'll let me sit in there for a while," he thought to himself, the thought giving him a glimmer of hope that he would survive the night. Shaking and exhausted, Bruce trudged forward, clutching his backpack to his chest to protect himself from the rain. When he reached the revolving doors of the hospital, Bruce paused, hesitating for a moment, knowing that he shouldn't be here to rest. But the need overcame him, and he walked in, trying to blend in with the people waiting. The people around him seemed to ignore him, partly because they were preoccupied with their own worries. Bruce huddled in a corner, clutching his backpack, looking up at the ceiling with tired, sad eyes. A nurse passing by in the hallway stopped when she saw a boy huddled, wet, and shivering in the corner. She hesitated a bit but decided to approach. "Hey, are you okay?" Her voice was soft, but Bruce only heard it vaguely, almost falling asleep. "Do you need any help?" the nurse asked again, this time kneeling down so she could look straight into Bruce's eyes. Bruce raised his head, his eyes weak. I just need a place to stay tonight. My mother is in the hospital and I have nowhere to sleep." His words were slow and choked as tears welled up in his eyes. The nurse was silent, her eyes filled with compassion and awkwardness, knowing that she couldn't leave the boy in the hallway. After some consideration, she decided to help Bruce stay temporarily. "Follow me, but remember to keep quiet." Bruce looked at her in surprise, his heart filled with gratitude but unable to say anything. He nodded, silently following. The nurse led Bruce through the deserted hallways, where few people passed by to avoid attracting attention. Arriving at a small room at the end, she opened the door, revealing a cramped space filled with medical boxes and supplies. "You can sleep here tonight, but remember to leave before the morning shift starts." Bruce bowed his head in thanks, his eyes sparkling with joy despite his exhaustion. The nurse left Bruce in the small room, her eyes still slightly worried before closing the door. Bruce leaned against the wall, breathing a sigh of relief. Reaching into his backpack, he took out a crumpled photo of the man his mother had said was his father. Bruce's eyes lingered on the photo, questions swirling in his mind. Who was he? Why did my mother never tell me about him? But then, he quickly put the photo back, knowing he had bigger things to worry about. Bruce curled up in the corner, his eyes slowly closing, feeling light despite the hard and cold floor. The fatigue quickly overcame him, and he fell asleep, leaving the pouring rain and the dark night outside. A few hours later, a nurse on the night shift passed by the hallway and noticed that the door to the storage room was slightly open. This surprised her, as it was usually locked. She gently pushed the door open, and the flashlight shone in, revealing Bruce sleeping, clutching his backpack. He seemed to have taken refuge here to avoid the cold rain outside. The nurse hesitated, but her awareness of hospital regulations quickly took over. This was not a place for children to sleep, so she gently closed the door and walked quickly to the administrative office. A few minutes later, she was standing in front of a social worker, briefly explaining the situation. The social worker nodded, preparing the paperwork before following the nurse back to where Bruce was sleeping, to understand the situation and provide appropriate support. In the apartment containing the hospital's schematic diagram, the nurse gently opened it, letting the light from the corridor shine into the quiet space. Bruce was still sleeping soundly, hugging the old technical backpack tightly, as if it was the only thing connecting him to the outside world. Looking at the boy, the social worker was quiet for a moment. His eyes were slightly tired and unfocused. Then Bruce suddenly woke up, his eyes wide open, filled with fear and confusion, as if in his short nap he had temporarily forgotten all his worries. What's going on?" Bruce stuttered, his voice weak and sleepy, but his hand still did not let go of the backpack, as if he was preparing for the worst. The social worker looked at the boy with a serious expression that was being resolved, symbolizing that the boy was currently just a problem that needed to be solved quickly. She had no time to hurt, let alone fight to listen to the boy's pleas. "You can't stay here anymore, Bruce. This is a hospital, not a shelter for street children. We can't let you wander around unsupervised." Her voice was unforgiving, the core of a foregone conclusion. Bruce felt as if all hope had been lost. The thought of being separated from his mother and taken to a strange place terrified him. "Please, I need to stay here. My mother is in a coma. I have no one else. I just want to be near her." His voice trembled, pleading. The social worker folded her arms, her eyes cold, answering with indifference, "Your mother is in a coma, and no one knows when or if she will wake up. No matter what, you can't live like this. This is not safe and it is not legal. We will send you to an orphanage, where you will be cared for and supervised." The word orphanage was like a sharp knife, cutting into Bruce's mind. It was a dead end, a place filled with abandoned children, isolated and waiting for loved ones who never came. "No, I can't go there. My mother might wake up, and even if I'm not here, she won't find me." "I don't want to leave her alone," he shouted, his voice echoing in the silence. The social worker shook her head, her expression unwavering. "Bruce, this isn't your decision. There's no other choice. You can't live on the streets, and a hospital is no place for a kid like you. At an orphanage, you'll have a place to sleep, food to eat, and maybe you'll be adopted." The word adopt was even more terrifying to Bruce. He didn't want a new family. He had a mother, even though she was lying motionless in a hospital bed. He screamed in despair, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I don't want to be fostered. I have a mother. I'll wake up. I need to wait here for her." The nurse who accompanied the social worker stepped forward, saying softly, "Abortion child, it's only good for you. You'll be well taken care of there. You need someone to take care of you." But Bruce could see it as a way out. All he heard were words of separation. Driven to the brink, filled with fear, he knew he had to act, find a way to hold on to the last shred of hope. He walked down the hallway, calculating his escape route. "I can't let them take me away from my mother," Bruce thought. Then, without waiting another second, he wrenched his arm from the nurse and ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the hospital air. "Yes, put it back," the social worker shouted, but Bruce didn't turn around. He ran as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his fists, ready to explode. He knew he had to escape before they caught him. Bruce ran through the dark corners, up the stairs, and kept running, with no destination in mind, only the thought of getting away from those people, the people who were trying to separate him from his mother. Finally, when the large doors of the hospital swung open, the cold wind of the rainy morning hit your face, making your breathing hitch. He reset for a moment, trying to catch his breath, trying to think of a plan. Suddenly, his eyes fell on a black car parked on the other side of the road. A man stepped out of the hospital, shielding himself from the rain with an umbrella. Bruce opened his mouth. It was the face in the photo his mother had shown him, the face he could never forget. "Dad," Bruce whispered, in euphoria. Without thinking, you ran across the street, shouting, "Dad, Dad." "It's me, Bruce," but the man didn't hear him. The car slowly rolled away, leaving the parking lot. "The flag is there." "Dad, don't go," Bruce shouted with all his might. His feet kept running, pounding the road, but the car got further and further away, then disappeared behind the rain waves. Bruce stopped. His breath was exhausted. Tears mixed with the rain. You felt like the whole world had diminished before your eyes. Bruce was still kneeling, his eyes fixed on the car that had disappeared into the rain. It felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He had lost his last chance to meet the man who could be his biological father. Tears rolled down, mixed with the sound of the heavy rain. Then suddenly a woman with an elegant umbrella passed by, stopping before his eyes. At first, her expression was full of curiosity, but quickly changed to a surprised realization when she heard Bruce calling the man father. "You just called him father, why?" she asked, her voice mixed with surprise and disbelief. Bruce quickly raised his head, hastily wiped his tears, but did not say a word. The feeling of shame and apprehension made him afraid of being looked down upon again. However, the woman seemed to still be curious, asking again, "Jimmy." "He is Jimmy." Right at the mention of the name, Bruce felt his insides twist, trying to grasp the meaning of her words. "Jimmy," he stuttered, his voice still hesitant. "Yes, Jimmy," she replied, a bitter smile on her lips. "He's one of the richest men in the city. He's having a meeting today at a fancy restaurant in a nearby shopping mall, finalizing some big investments. But you're a street kid. How could you be the son of someone like him?" She said it more sarcastically than curiously, making Bruce's stomach twist. He's my father," Bruce said, his voice choking, the words feeling heavy as iron. But then Bruce's phone rang, breaking the heavy silence. His heart pounded as he heard the doctor's serious voice. "Bruce, this is Chloe's doctor. You need to go to the hospital immediately. Your mother's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Go. There is not much time left." Bruce stood there, still clutching the phone, as if afraid that if he let go, everything would disappear. The sense of reality faded as the doctor's words echoed in his head, the announcement that his mother's condition was getting worse than ever. His mind was filled with fear, mixed with faint hope and deep despair. His eyes began to water. He repeated the doctor's words again, as if to convince himself that it wasn't true, that there might be a miracle that would save his mother. As he looked up, Bruce's eyes met Jimmy, an estranged father who was suddenly standing before him, looking at him with a strange determination. Jimmy's eyes, despite having been through so much, now shone with a new light, as if a sense of responsibility had awakened. In a deep, firm voice, he promised to do everything he could to help his mother, that she would be transferred to the best hospital possible. Bruce couldn't believe his ears. It was almost surreal that someone was willing to help him like this. He had been alone in his struggles for so long, and now suddenly someone was on his side. "You're really going to do that?" he asked, looking at Jimmy with tears in his eyes as if expecting a miracle. Jimmy nodded resolutely. "I'll do whatever it takes." He immediately took out his phone and started making calls, arranging every detail of Chloe's transfer. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford to waste. Every second that passed could be the last. "Don't worry, Bruce. I'll make sure your mother gets the best care." At that moment, Rose, who had been watching from afar with doubtful eyes, stepped forward, arms crossed over her chest, her tone annoyed. "Are you really going to transfer her to a private hospital?" as if it's your responsibility?" Rose asked, unable to hide her displeasure. She couldn't understand why Jimmy was rushing into this situation like it belonged to him, when there was no clarity between them about the past. "Yes, Rose. That's exactly what I would do," Jimmy replied, his eyes unwavering despite the busy organization of the phone call. "She's Bruce's mother, and even though I just found out, it's my responsibility to help." Rose shook her head, her eyes filled with disbelief. "This doesn't make sense. You barely know the boy, and now you want to help a woman who disappeared from your life years ago. Are you listening to yourself?" Rose was starting to lose patience, while Bruce looked at Jimmy, his heart clenched at the discord between them. Bruce said softly, barely audible, "I have nowhere else to go. My mother and I lost our home. I only have my mother." Jimmy paused, phone still in hand, eyes fixed on the boy standing in front of him. The boy confessed a heartbreaking truth, carrying all the sadness and despair. The image of a child who had lost everything, alone on the road to fend for himself, made Jimmy feel unable to turn away. "You don't have a home anymore?" Jimmy asked, his voice heavy. He couldn't imagine the pain Bruce was going through. Bruce nodded, eyes looking down at the ground, seemingly not wanting to appear weak. "I slept on the street near the hospital because I had nowhere else to go." The words filled with sadness rang out from Bruce's lips, like a painful confession. Jimmy felt a lump in his throat. The thought that the boy, who could be his son, was wandering the streets with no one to care for him was unacceptable. "You're coming to live with me," he said, his decision without hesitation. "I won't leave you on the streets." Bruce looked up at Jimmy, stunned. "You're saying I can stay with you?" "I don't know what to say." His voice caught, and for the first time in a long time he felt a glimmer of hope. But before Jimmy could continue, Rose interrupted, her voice even sharper. "You're taking this boy home," she shouted, furious. "Have you completely lost your mind, Jimmy? He comes out of nowhere with a story that has no basis, and you want to take him home? This is crazy." Jimmy sighed, knowing Rose's reaction would be violent, but he had no way back. "Rose, I know this seems strange, but I know Bruce is telling the truth. I used to know Chloe. She's not a liar. I can't leave Bruce alone." Rose shook her head, her voice filled with frustration and worry. "You're putting everything into this situation, and what if it's a lie? Have you thought about that?" Bruce watched Rose and Jimmy argue with a sinking heart. He didn't want to be the cause of this argument, but he had no choice. He needed Jimmy, he needed help, or he would lose his mother forever. Jimmy kept his eyes steady on Rose. "I'll take responsibility for this. I know it's a complicated situation, but we need to do what we have to do. Now we're going to get Bruce home." The silence between them was tense. Jimmy looked at Bruce, feeling the pain that was engulfing him. He sat down next to Bruce on the cold park bench, the boy's small back still shaking from the tears that had not stopped falling. "Bruce," Jimmy said softly, his voice low and warm, full of concern, "my life with Rose has been difficult for a long time. You're not the cause, you're just a boy who tried to do the right thing to help his mother. You didn't cause any trouble that you couldn't handle." Bruce bowed his head, his hands tightening on the straps of his backpack as if it were all he had in the world. He couldn't believe that he was witnessing another family, after losing their own, begin to fall apart because of him. It felt like an endless cycle of loss and pain. "I just wanted to help my mother, but every time I asked for help, things got worse," Bruce whispered, his voice choked with pent-up emotion. Jimmy listened, clearly sensing the anxiety and desperation in Bruce's words. He gently placed a hand on his shoulder, providing a comforting support for the lonely boy. "Bruce, what you did for your mother was very brave. Not everyone has that kind of courage," Jimmy said, his voice steady. "You don't have to go through all this alone. I'm here to help you, and I'm not giving up. Rose is just confused and angry, but that doesn't mean things can't change." Bruce looked up, his eyes red with confusion. I don't want to be a burden. I just want my mother to be well, and I don't want anyone to make any sacrifices for me. Jimmy smiled, a sad but determined smile. We all have our moments of weakness and need the help of others. What matters is that you tried for your mother, for the person you love. That's something everyone would admire. The two sat there in silence, the cold air of the night making everything seem to slow down. The comfort Jimmy brought began to soothe Bruce's unease, although there were still fears and doubts that could not be removed. Jimmy understood that he could not force Bruce to trust immediately, but he would be here, by his side on this journey. Jimmy looked at Bruce, his heart filled with a sense of responsibility and determination. "Come home with me," Bruce Jimmy said, his voice warm. "We'll face it all together. I promise I'll never leave you alone again." Bruce looked at Jimmy's outstretched hand, feeling a small ray of hope creep into his wounded soul. He felt like someone was willing to step into his world of pain and anxiety, accepting it all. After a moment of hesitation, Bruce nodded slightly, placing his hand in Jimmy's, letting Jimmy lead the way. On the way back, the two walked silently. Bruce did not say anything, but Jimmy could feel the emotions swirling silently in his heart. After months of being hurt and losing trust, Bruce had finally met someone who made him feel safe. Jimmy knew that from this moment on, he could not let Bruce feel lost in this house anymore. As soon as he entered the mansion, Jimmy decided that the next morning he would have a frank talk with Rose. He could not let Bruce live in fear and invisible threats for another day. For Jimmy, family was not only a responsibility to Rose but also a promise to protect a lost boy who needed love and safety. Jimmy approached, his eyes looking deeply into Bruce's, as if to confirm the sincerity in each word. "I helped you not because you forced me or caused this. You bravely saved your mother, and I truly admire that." Jimmy gently placed his hand on Bruce's shoulder, as if transmitting warmth and trust. "You didn't ruin anything. Uncle and Rose will find a way, but right now you and your mom are the most important." Bruce choked up, trying to believe Jimmy's words, but his heart was still heavy. "I just wish things could be different. I wish my mom would be healthy again and no one would have to suffer because of me." Just as Jimmy was about to comfort him, his phone suddenly rang. He tried to ignore it, but it kept ringing. He picked it up, and a voice from the hospital rang out. "Jimmy, I'm telling you, Chloe, she just woke up from her coma." Jimmy was stunned, feeling both relieved and worried. He turned to Bruce, his hand on his shoulder, his eyes gentle. "Your mom woke up." Bruce stopped crying, his eyes sparkling with hope. "Mom woke up," he muttered, surprise mixed with radiant joy. Jimmy nodded, smiling slightly. "Yes, your mother is awake. We have to go to the hospital now." Without hesitation, Bruce stood up, his eyes determined. Jimmy led him to the car and quickly drove to the hospital. All the way, Bruce was silent, his eyes following the scenery outside, his heart filled with thoughts. Mom is awake. I'm going to see her again, but hidden in that hope was a vague fear. When they arrived at the hospital, Jimmy parked the car and rushed inside with Bruce. At the door, Bruce saw his mother lying on the bed, pale but her eyes were open. Chloe smiled gently when she saw Bruce, although still weak. Bruce rushed to his mother's side, holding her hand tightly, tears streaming down his face, but this time they were tears of relief. "Mom, I was scared. I was scared I would never see you again." Chloe weakly stroked Bruce's face, trying to reassure him. "It's me, baby. I'm still here." She turned her head to look at Jimmy, her eyes filled with emotion. Jimmy walked in, calling softly. "Chloe." Chloe looked at him, her eyes filled with affection. "You've always been there for us, Jimmy." In that moment, Bruce looked at his mother and Jimmy, feeling a deep connection between them, a connection he had never understood before. All the hurt and distance gradually disappeared, giving way to love and reunion. Since then, that small family has overcome all challenges together. The house became a warm place, where everyone found peace when they returned. Chloe looked around, smiling with satisfaction. Now our family is truly complete. And they knew, no matter how stormy the weather, they still had each other, together welcoming everything that was coming.